And we are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the worldwide Coalition Media Network, here at the Go Local Live Broadcast Center, 90 Way Boston Street in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. It's a beautiful, slightly steamy summer evening here. We're hoping that after the show, you will hop in your cars, grab a lift, take a Riptor, whatever it makes, come down to the down city, come down to Providence, enjoy everything that this capital city has to offer. It's a wonderful night to spend, whether it be outdoors, having a cocktail and a light dinner, or any one of Rhode Island's favorite live venues, bars, restaurants. Thayer Street, Wickenden Street, downtown in the nightclub district over by Richmond Street. The fun starts at about 9 o'clock, and wow, there are more ways to enjoy yourself in Providence than I think than any place alive. Folks, a very special evening. First of all, of course, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio, our all apolitical anti-billionaire baseball boys club feed at Pawtucket is Home, where we continue to monitor the recent issue of As the Stomach Turns, as yet another Hail Mary pass is thrown by the city of Pawtucket, Mayor Don Grebian, in their attempt to secure your taxpayer dollars to support what ultimately is a private investment owned by millionaires. CoalitionRadio.us, and of course, Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio. It is a great pleasure that we introduce our next guest. Of course, if you're a Rhode Islander, you need no introduction. He's been part of our civic and public life for, well, a generation now. We were pleased to have him a few years ago on the Coalition when he joined Mike Riley and Dan Harrop, and I think to this date, not because of my participation, but ultimately their conversation, I believe the most important conversation on municipal bankruptcy this state has ever seen. It turned out to be prescient. There are issues that still remain raised by those gentlemen in that hour that are still as yet to be addressed and looming even larger. But that's another conversation. Judge Robert Flanders is running for the United States Senate against an incumbent Democrat. He is not facing a primary election. The current incumbent is someone that we had on the show a few weeks ago, a wonderful woman who I think is going to give him fits and starts. That remains to be seen. But the conversation tonight is going to focus on Judge Flanders. Number one, his life, his background as a Rhode Islander. Number two, his legal expertise and his legal career. And then we're going to spend 20 minutes or so talking about, as we do here on the Coalition, issues. As always, the ground rules are simple. Number one, we don't handicap elections. I'm not interested in polls, fundraising, any one of the ancillary issues that seem to obsess the current legacy media. I'm not interested if you're going to win. I'm interested in why you should, which is why we focus here on issues that are not outrage porn. Judge Flanders, welcome back to the Coalition.
Thank you, Pat. Just one not-so-minor correction. I am also facing a primary. There's a Californian named Rocky De La Fuente.
Rocky De La Fuente. I've met Rocky De La Fuente.
Have you? Wow.
Yes, I may be one of 2 Rhode Islanders who has. You have nothing to fear.
It's unfortunate that the situation is that he's running in 5 or 6 different states.
Right, you are correct.
Californian, he's run as a Democrat before, an independent, and now he's running, I guess, as a Republican in all these states. And by some quirk of constitutional law, he's been deemed qualified, even though he doesn't live here and has no intention of ever being here. I don't think he's ever visited Rhode Island. No. But the Constitution of the U.S. Says that to be a candidate, you need to be a resident or an inhabitant of the state when you're elected. And so lower courts have dealt with that, have said that the states, in effect, can't impose earlier residency requirements than what the U.S. Constitution specifies. And so the Board of Elections ruled that he's entitled to run.
I happened to meet very briefly, as I remember correctly, Mr. De La Fuente at the Libertarian National Convention in Orlando, where he set up shop, and very briefly, and I believe issued a more than passing threat to run for the presidency there. Not quite sure what the motivation is, but again, I think you have nothing to fear in that respect. I'd like to focus in the first couple minutes on a conversation we had a number of years ago. Reintroduce yourself, as if you need to, but reintroduce yourself into your background as a young person here, and some of the experiences you had, where you come from, where you went to school, how you managed to get through school, and some of the interesting career turns you've taken prior to immersing yourself in the law.
Well, if this were a deposition, I'd object on the grounds that that's a multi-part question.
Right.
But I'm
Run with it.
happy to start. So, I grew up on Long Island, New York, Massapequa, New York. I was the
Mhm.
oldest of 7 children, come from a very humble working-class family, first in my family to go to college.
Mhm.
We lived in a small cape, 1 bathroom, with 5 sisters and a brother, and so
Mhm.
my parents were working people. My dad started out as a union steward in a military factory, and spent most of his career working as a salesman for food distributors. My mom, when she wasn't raising the 7 kids, worked in fast food restaurants. My parents always stressed the value of hard work and education. They sacrificed to send me to a Catholic high school, Catholic all-boys school in Mineola, Chaminade High School. And I was good enough in sports and academics to be recruited by the Ivy League, and ended up at Brown, where I was there on a financial aid scholarship, but was fortunate enough to quarterback the football team, captain the baseball team, and be elected to Phi Beta Kappa. And then I was drafted by the Detroit Tigers and played minor league baseball for 3 years while I was attending Harvard Law School during the academic year.
Mhm.
So that's an unusual background. I also, from high school on, worked in a lot of manual labor jobs. My first job was as a garbage man in my hometown. In college and law school, I had to work as part of my scholarship, my financial aid. I was a dishwasher, a floor sweeper, a delivery man, a bagger in a mattress factory. Did a lot of jobs of that sort for minimum wages. My parents and my family lived paycheck to paycheck, so I know what that's all about.
Mhm.
And so I bring that work ethic to this Senate race. And so here in Rhode Island, I was, of course, a lawyer. I was the head of our litigation department at Edwards and Angel, a venerable Providence firm that has now morphed into something else. But at the time, it was the largest firm, and I was a business litigator there.
Mhm.
While I was doing that, I also was elected town councilman in my then hometown of Barrington, Rhode Island.
Mhm.
Served 2 terms as the vice president of that council. And then founded my own small business law firm, Flanders and Medeiros, which I did for 10 years. And so knew what it's like to own and run a small business. We had 10 or 12 lawyers, a boutique focusing on business litigation matters.
Mhm.
And then I was asked to put my name in the hat for a Supreme Court vacancy, coming right from the bar. I wasn't a judge at the time. And I was selected by Governor Rahman to fill the vacancy. Now, this was right after there was the judicial reform where they put together a
Right.
so-called merit selection process, whereas before they were more or less getting folks from the General Assembly to be judges.
Mhm.
This opened it up. I was given a chance to be a judge, and the postman doesn't always ring twice, so I took that, and I was confirmed by both houses of the General Assembly and became a Supreme Court judge on our highest court for the next 8.5 years, and wrote over 400 opinions for that court. And then I decided that it would be nice to go back into private practice again while I still was young enough to have some life left as a business litigator, and also to do other forms of public service. And so after leaving the court in 2004, I was asked by the then governor to head up the Board of Regents for elementary and secondary education, which I did for 4 years. And then the next governor was elected, Governor Chafee, and that happened to coincide with all the problems that Central Falls was having.
Mhm.
So he asked me to go in there as the state-appointed receiver and work with all sides to try and come to a better place than they were at. They were defaulting on all their obligations, and the city needed to be restructured. We put it through a bankruptcy process, and were able to get agreements with all the unions, all the retirees, notwithstanding some very drastic adjustments that needed to be made in order to bring the city to fiscal stability and solvency. And we left there in 13 months with a balanced budget and a 5-year plan of recovery for the city that happily they followed, and now are in a position where they're bragging about surpluses for the first time in memory, and being a comeback city in Rhode Island. So that turned out very well, and I want to bring that same problem-solving skill set to Washington, which I think sorely needs a person who is able to work with all sides in very difficult, controversial situations, bring these warring parties together, try to reach a consensus, try to compromise, be transparent, and come to solutions that will benefit our country and our state. So that's what I'm hoping to do, and that's one of the big reasons why I'm running for U.S. Senate.
So let's go back to nearly the beginning. A product of a solidly middle-class upbringing. You were fortunate enough to go to, to parochial schools, which gave you an opportunity to go to the Ivy League. If you can, particularly now, you've had a very successful career in relatively every aspect of the law. This may seem almost anecdotal, but it's important to our listeners. You were the beneficiary and earned a truly, what would we describe now as a liberal arts education, at really the highest level. How important is it right now in terms of our education in this nation to try and reintroduce, get away from the technocracy, and reintroduce the spirit of developing inquisitive thinking, developing people who can work with logic, so that they can have the ability to engage either in the law or to problem solve, or any one of the architecture, engineering, or anything. How important is a classic liberal arts education to young people?
To me, it was everything. It was my ticket out of an otherwise humdrum life. To me, it was a door opener. It introduced me to concepts and thoughts, and so to me it's absolutely true. Education has always been a great opportunity to move through the strata of society, to make something of yourself, develop your own personality, your own character. So I think it's critically important. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody needs to get a liberal arts education. I think anybody who wants one ought to get one, because I think it's so beneficial. But at the same time, I concede that not everybody's cut out for it, and so I think we need to also have folks who are able to get trained in skills that will be useful to them as they go into the working world, because it's not a one-size-fits-all situation anymore. To be a car mechanic, you need to have computer skills, you need to have training. So while I'm a big proponent of a liberal arts education, because I'm a Exhibit A for being a beneficiary of that, I've often said that I consider myself a living embodiment of the American dream, and a large part of that is having the luck to have great parents, and to also have an education and that would help me achieve the dreams that I had for myself and for my family. And so as I said, I believe heartily in the importance of getting a good education. I believe it should be available to anybody who wants to pursue that, but at the same time I concede that it's not necessarily the thing for everybody, and there ought to be alternative paths for people to follow.
Your next step in your career path was as a litigator, and I think there's a sense by a lot of folks that they've got a little bit too much Clarence Darrow and Perry Mason on their minds. Ultimately, a litigator is someone who problem solves and negotiates more solutions that they end up in court on. How, the ability to work with different people and different concerns and different issues and come up with a result that is at least palatable, I think is fundamental to what's missing in politics right now.
Absolutely. I think that's a skill set that I bring, because all my professional life as a litigator and as a lawyer, I've worked with people who have opposite points of view. I value the importance of compromise, of getting to positions that may not be ideal, but which are livable and which is better than other alternatives that you're facing, the cost and so forth of litigation, the aggravation. So that background, I think, is critical to what we want and need in our legislators, because they, especially in today's partisan environment, it's important to bring people together and find common ground and have the ability to compromise and work with people to get to a better place than, either my way or the highway. And that doesn't work, and that's, I think, and this is, both parties are guilty of this down in Washington. So that skill set, I think, that background of working with other people, solving controversies, most cases don't, as you say, end up in front of a jury or a judge. Most of them are worked out through settlements and resolutions among the lawyers and their clients. And it's also working with your clients and persuading them that here are your options, this is one way to go, here's another way, and here's how I would counsel you to go forward. And I think those are the same skills that will be useful to me as our next senator.
Your next stage then was into the courtroom on the other side, if you will, as someone, as a judge, literally at the highest level. Now, we've all become, in the last, well, since Bork really, become sort of armchair experts in the process of approving and analyzing a judge's backgrounds, issues. It's kind of a dangerous thing because it's, I think, present company included, I think a lot of us think we understand more than we do. What type of judge were you? How would you, your in terms of the type of, your approach to the law, your approach to the Rhode Island State Constitution, what was your overriding philosophy, if you will, in the courtroom?
So I was a judge that I would say focused on trying to fulfill the judicial role, which is to apply and interpret the law and not invest the law with your personal preferences and your politics and your beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
I think the function of a judge is to carry out the law as it's enacted and as it's written, according to the meaning that most people would understand those terms in the legislation or otherwise to mean.
Mm-hmm.
And so I try to play it right down the middle and not go one way or the other in terms of philosophy and so forth. Now, that said, I often found myself dissenting from my colleagues, and
Mm-hmm.
I didn't hesitate to disagree with them publicly if I felt that their analysis was wrong. But mostly our differences weren't ones of philosophy or politics. It was mostly interpreting the law, applying constitutional provisions, in particular separation of powers, you may remember, was a big issue. What does it mean in our Constitution to have three separate branches of government, and can one branch trespass on the core duties of another, such as when the legislature was appointing itself and its cronies to executive boards and commissions, or is that inconsistent with the separation of powers? And so those are basic, fundamental first principles that as a judge I had to apply. And one of the wonderful things about being a high court judge is you get to deal with issues that you've never even thought about before. And for the first time you're confronted with, here's a provision in our Constitution. What does it mean? So for example, our Constitution in Rhode Island has a provision that says that people have a right to keep and bear arms. So for the first time, really, were called upon to interpret that. And to my astonishment, the majority ruled that, that really means only if you're in the military, because arms are a military term according to them, and therefore, unless you're in the military, you're not allowed to keep and bear arms. And I said that makes no sense. It's not faithful to the text, and it's not faithful to the history of that provision. So I issued a dissent in that case, which is one of the last cases I wrote on as a judge, which said that there unquestionably should be and is an individual right to bear arms. Of course, this was before the Heller decision at the U.S. Supreme Court level, which agreed with me in terms of the outcome at the federal level. And even there was militia language in the federal Constitution that we don't have in our Constitution. So it was more of an issue there as to whether that bearing arms business was limited to militia service. And of course, the U.S. Supreme Court held that it is not, and that you have an individual right to keep and bear arms. So as a judge, I would say that I was a textualist. I took the meaning of the words seriously. I tried to apply what I thought that our framers and the people who had accepted those provisions would have known them to mean, and tried to play it as close as I could, right down the middle, and not try and influence things by what I would have done if I was sitting as a constitutional convention person voting on these provisions and everything like that.
Right. And I want to talk about Central Falls, but, and clearly there's an entire conversation to be had about the judiciary at the federal level, because as tempting as it is to frame your election right now in terms of local issues, really what we need to be analyzing are federal issues. You're being elected, and call me Captain Obvious here, but we're talking about a federal position that's going to have a direct impact on areas of significance at the federal level, including, but not limited to, judiciary appointments, issues of state in foreign policy. These are all critical elements. So, I mean, what we've got, and I think we've always had it through history, and perhaps we're just, because of the media, we're more exposed and more familiar with it, is what I'll call judge shopping at the federal level. You know, you're looking, at this point in particular, there are three really, court cases that seem to be litmus tests for jurists, and that would be obviously Heller, that would be Roe v. Wade, and that would be Citizens United. If you were to take all three of those, that seems to be the holy trinity with which each side, if you will, is looking at a court-appointed position. So I want you to think about that in a second, because I want to talk about Central Falls. But clearly, a key role for you in the United States Senate, particularly if you're, as I would think, if you're elected and there's a Republican presidency, I would imagine you would be appointed, given your experience, to the Judiciary Committee. I mean, one would hope, but hold that for a second. The Central Falls, it was nuclear, or as our President Bush would have said, nuclear back then, and there's an attempt in this campaign to revive the issue and make it a political football now. In your opinion, just to make it very simple, are the residents, and this is the important thing, the residents, the average resident of the village of Central Falls, are they better off now or before the bankruptcy?
Well, that's a softball, because it's clear to me, and I hope to the citizens of Central Falls and to Rhode Island, that they're better off now. The city is in much better shape.
Mm-hmm.
As I said, they're having surpluses. There's a new spirit of optimism, and I think much credit goes to the mayor there, Diosa, who was a councilman when I came into the city.
Mm-hmm.
I think clearly they're in much better shape financially. I think they're now focusing on economic development, which is obviously the next thing that they need to do. I think following the blueprint that we left them to have a balanced budget and have a restructuring of the obligations that they were saddled with, which the cities had given away the store basically in benefits, and
Mm-hmm.
that they couldn't afford, and that were crippling them. And this was like 2 decades worth of administration, the Democratic administration, I might add, that was a situation where they were over-promising and under-delivering. They weren't taxing to meet the benefits that they had given up, and the whole house of cards was falling. And so they were going to default on everything, and people would have lost all of their pensions and the benefits and the jobs that were all at stake would have all gone away if we hadn't come in and saved the city in a way that salvaged as much as we could of the pensions. We restructured the benefits so that the city could afford them, and we dealt with the active employees in a way that, after listening to how they felt about what could be done to get them in a better place, we put together new agreements, and the city, I think, is now prospering as a result of all that. So the answer to your question, quite directly, is it should be obvious that the city is in so much better shape now, and the residents of the city are in better shape from a tax standpoint than they were certainly before we came in there.
So, in my opinion, the folks who objected at the time and who continue to try to raise these false flags are folks who were in power at the time or benefit by being connected to power at the time. I mean, the only real disruption in terms of a long-term picture, and I understand that people, that there were haircuts to be had. But I believe you made a pretty famous quote at the time when you talked about the haircut you could take or the haircut you might end up having to take. Something words to that effect.
Well, the actual quote was that a haircut still looks a lot better than a beheading. And
That's right.
The beheading was the fact that they were about to lose their pensions completely.
Right.
And so as painful as it was, and it was horribly painful, and as I said to them, it's not fair that these promised benefits are just not going to happen. But those who are now trying to kill the messenger, in effect, that I had nothing to do with creating the situation.
Right.
I was coming in there to try and fix it and work out as best I could. And the state had refused at that time to come in and bail them out. And they said, look, if we bail you out, we've got Providence, we've got Woonsocket, we've got East Providence, other cities
West Warwick
are
was
circling the
yes.
drain, West Warwick. If we come in and bail out Central Falls, the tiniest city in Rhode Island, we're going to set a precedent that we can't possibly fulfill with all these other places.
Right.
So you've got to make do with whatever you can from the resources you have and your own imagination to try and work out this problem. And it was basically a situation where people thought it was an impossible, intractable problem to try and figure it out. But putting together a good team, and this was not just all me, I had a great team working for me, bond lawyers, labor lawyers, municipal people. So I had plenty of good counsel and advice. The state was helpful as well in terms of providing assistance, but not monetary because they weren't in a position to do that. So it's unquestionably the case that the city is in a much better place, and as painful as it was at the time, but for the intervention that occurred, the city may not even exist at this point.
Right. And do you think we'll ever get to a point in Rhode Island where we'll stop blaming the messenger and actually look to accord responsibility to the folks who created these delusions of grandeur in terms of what government could provide?
I wish I could say yes, Pat, but human nature being what it is, they want to look for the immediate, what they see as the immediate cause of the problem. So when somebody like myself has to stand up in an auditorium full of retirees,
Right.
ask them to give up one half of their pensions, and they naturally they want to lynch me and throw rotten tomatoes at me because I'm telling them what the reality is. But as you say, I have nothing to do with creating the situation. It was the question of trying to make do. As I said at the time, there was no miracle of the loaves and the fishes here. We had limited resources to try
Right.
and straighten the situation out, and it was terribly unfortunate that they were having to suffer the brunt of this. And the real culprits, though, were the people they elected. They got democracy good and hard in Central Falls because the folks they elected there let them down big time. And unfortunately, the workers and the retirees had to suffer the brunt of it. But for the state, it was also beneficial because other mayors in Providence and these other folks that were also having financial difficulties could wave the bloody shirt of Central Falls in the face of their unions and their retirees and said, look, if you don't agree to these concessions that we're asking you to make, you're going to suffer the same fate as Central Falls. And you want to lose 50%, or you want to accept this better plan that we're putting forward that will help us get to a better situation. Now, as fate would have it, they didn't go far enough in Providence and these other folks, and they're still facing the same difficulties that they had back in the days of Central Falls. But it did help them obtain concessions. And of course, Gina Raimondo, you'll recall, seized on the Central Falls example and used that to drive through pension reform at the state level.
Right.
While at the same time not doing anything about the still festering problems in the other cities and towns that also had local managed pension plans that were undergoing similar problems as in Central Falls. Perhaps not as severe in many cases, but still begging for restructuring of the kind and order of magnitude that went on in Central Falls.
Right, and it's also telling to this day that despite being in a stock market that literally has no precedent, upon which is the foundation within which so many of these investment funds are based, that despite that, you've still got, as Mike Riley has pointed out very aptly in his campaign, significant underfunding to this day that is structural, and we are one, I believe, and again, this is, you're not running for state and local office, so I'm not asking you to be saddled with solving this, but ultimately, we're one correction away from chaos. And you know, and a severe correction along the forms, God forbid, of what happened, and I'm not wishing it on anybody, but of what happened in 2008 could be a nightmare here.
Well, remember, the remedy in Central Falls was a federal remedy. It's a federal municipal bankruptcy provision that was the tool to restructure the city. It was a tool to be able to take existing contracts and basically say, no, we can't do what the city fathers had committed to do 3, 4, some odd years ago. That's out the window now. We have to look at what the city can afford. And so uniquely, the federal bankruptcy mechanism, the tool, enables you to avoid contracts that are unaffordable from the city's standpoint and start fresh. So it's basically enables you to push the reset button in these cities that have gotten themselves over their heads and are at the point where they're literally insolvent or about to be insolvent, and enables you to start fresh. Now, there's no guarantee that Central Falls or any of these other places that go through this won't eventually relapse to the same situation that caused them to go through this restructuring in the first place. But at least it gives a chance to start again,
right.
And hopefully you can draw some lessons from that experience and get to a better place going forward, where you basically say to your taxpayers, never again.
Right. No, and I agree with you completely on the whole premise that Central Falls could have somehow lurched along, crisis to crisis, and survived what clearly, ironically, it was then Treasurer Gina Raimondo who really phrased the entire issue in terms of a simple concept. It's math.
Yeah.
It's really, it's not in a personal desire to ruin someone's future. It's not a personal desire. It's simply math.
And you know, it was math that was brought about by human folly.
Right.
And so, but the problem was a mathematical problem, and one needed to apply the formula to get it right.
Mm-hmm. That's excellent. And folks, we will rebroadcast. Again, it was a prescient, the conversation that the three of you had back then, and a lot of these conditions exist today. But let's move on to the federal. And by the way, if you're just joining us, this is the Coalition on the GoLocalLive network. Joining us in studio, Justice Robert Flanders. He is running for the United States Senate technically for the Republican nomination of the United States Senate against one Rocky DeFluenta, but ultimately will face the winner of a Democratic primary, currently, at least in news coverage, dominated by an incumbent, but for whom exists quite, and she was on the show just a few weeks ago, quite the spunky, I think, a fascinating opponent. She exists on an ethical level that clearly the incumbent is going to be somewhat challenged by. Let's move on to the federal then. An opportunity from a kid from the North Shore, all right, to serve in the United States Senate is very real here. That's got to be compelling stuff for you and your family.
Oh, it's an opportunity of a lifetime, but it's something that I feel like I've prepared all my life to do with all the things we just talked about. And so I'm doing this, though, for one reason. I want to serve Rhode Island. I don't think Rhode Island's being well served right now. And we've got a global alarmist, as I like to call him, in office, who really, in my opinion, hasn't done much to help Rhode Island in particular. And we've got so much that we need to address. The worst roads and bridges in the country. We've got healthcare that's hanging fire. We need a new concept as to how to deal with our healthcare situation. We've got outrageous drug prices. We've got an opioid crisis. So there was no short. Immigration is obviously something that needs to be addressed. Border security. We could go on and on with the issues, but the point is that we need a senator down there who could sit at the policy-making table, work with both sides, work with the administration, and get stuff done for Rhode Island. My North Star is gonna be what's good for this state. What's gonna help average Rhode Islanders, families, businesses, get to a better place. If President Trump is doing things that are gonna help us, then I'm gonna be right by his side. But when he does things that are hurtful to Rhode Island, or not in our best interest, or not in the best interest of the country, I'm gonna be in his face about it. So that's the way I'm gonna be. I'm gonna be country and state above party, and that's to me what the job is. You want a senator down there, though, who can sit at the policy table. Right now, we've got a monolithically Democratic delegation who is, throwing stones at the folks that are trying to score points on the field, and we really don't have anybody there that can carry the water for Rhode Island, and I'd like to be able to do that in a way that we don't. I think we're best served, Pat, when we have bipartisan representation down there. Remember the days of John Chafee with Claiborne Pell? To me, that is the paradigm. We have balance. You need some representation from each party, particularly in a situation as we have now, where the entire executive branch is in the hands of the Republican Party, not just the presidency, all the executive agencies. Congress is in Republican hands, and the reality is that whatever might happen in the House, on the Senate side, there are, I think, 26 Democrats up for election and only 8 Republican senators. So the exposure on the Democratic side is much greater, and the odds are that it's going to be very difficult for the Democratic Party to flip the control of the Senate. That's going to stay for sure, I think, in Republican hands. So I'm just saying to Rhode Islanders, among other reasons to get the incumbent out of the office, is let's get somebody down there who can work with the majority party for the benefit of this state and its people. And we don't have that now.
You are elected to the United States Senate. Now, you're a freshman senator. To a certain degree, the way the system works, you would be part of the ruling party, so you would have some clout. You begin at the beginning, at sort of the basement level. But if you had your choice, I ascribe to you by definition, based on your experience with the judiciary, but is there a particular area that you would look forward to? If they said, Judge Flanders, where can we set you up?
Well, I'd like to work on committees that have to do with small business, that can advocate, because I think Rhode Island is predominantly a small business state.
Interesting.
We've got fishing businesses, we've got certainly defense contractors and defense industry. I think small business and entrepreneurialism is the heart of America, and so I want to be able to do things that can help jobs and our economy thrive. There probably are a number of committees that could do that, but I want to be on one or more of those. I'd love to be on a committee such as transportation that could work with our roads and bridges and our infrastructure, protect our coastlines, and work on infrastructure projects for airports and ports of entry. So I think these are all things that are important to Rhode Island, but obviously there are other things that I could be helpful on. Judiciary certainly would be one for my background, and judicial nominations are very important, as we'll see with the Kavanaugh nomination that's now coming up. The Democrats, including Senator Whitehouse, have already basically said no way, no how, but I think absent some development during the hearings, which would be totally out of character, I would think that he should be confirmed because he's got an excellent background, and he seems to be a sound judge who applies the law according to the way it's written, and is not somebody that is investing his own ideas of what ought to be in the Constitution, and, but isn't actually in there. So that's sort of the approach that I take, and I think Gorsuch was a good appointment, Justice Gorsuch, and I think. Look, I think the policy making ought to be done by the legislature and not by the judiciary. Let's stick to basic first principles in the way our country was founded. I don't think we want judges making up policy. I think we want to leave that to the legislature, let the president and the executive branch execute the laws. I mean, that's what makes this country great, and I'd hate to see us go down a path where we've got a socialist movement building on the other side of the Democratic Party. And if some of those folks get into office, we're going to be really having a struggle to beat that back, because as you know, it hasn't worked wherever it's been tried, and we don't want to turn us into even a mini Venezuela or any of these other places that have tried this and have failed.
In terms of the upcoming Supreme Court hearings or the process, the process for SCOTUS, as they like to say, has become so bitter, so politicized. Now, you can play tit for tat, but arguably goes back to pork. I mean, that's
Became a verb.
I was about to say, for a while there, if you got borked, everybody knew what you were talking about. Flash forward then to Merrick Garland. Should Merrick Garland have been heard before President Obama's?
Well, again, it was ideally yes, but I understand completely what Mitch McConnell was trying to do there. He felt there was an upcoming presidential election, and he pulled a force majeure play that ended up getting Neil Gorsuch on the court instead of Merrick Garland. Now, Merrick Garland, I think, would have been a fine judge, probably left-leaning, but
Undoubtedly.
But he wasn't. I don't think he was a bomb thrower from the left. But I think, look, let's not pretend that the whole confirmation thing isn't infested with political considerations. It obviously is. And the whole process has gone from basically a very quick and expedient situation where if the person had credentials, he was or she was confirmed. But now it's become a kabuki theater exercise where
that's for sure.
Everybody gets to throw their political snowballs at whoever is up there. And
well, let me jump in with a question, because this brings up, I think, an important point. I think politics have, you're a sports fan, obviously. I think politics have become victim of what I call the sports center complex. Whereas, whether it be hearings, whether it be talking head shows, whether it be talk radio, everyone is more intent on making a highlight film than they are in actually accomplishing something. I'll say that both sides are equally guilty of that.
Yeah, I agree.
If you and I are both old enough to know that appointment hearings have always been politicized, just like newspapers have always been biased. This is not, contrary to certain beliefs, this is not a new development. But at the same time, I don't, having been old enough to remember the Watergate hearings and watch them, and by the way, for the record, yes, I volunteered as an 11-year-old for the committee for the re-election of the president. Very proud. But ultimately, it seems more so than ever that when you watch these appointment hearings, particularly at the Supreme Court level, where there's so much at stake, individual senators are speaking directly to the cameras and directly to, whether it be CNN, MSNBC, was I going to say Breitbart? Any one of a number of whatever their preferred, and how much, in your opinion, has that diminished the process?
Well, I think it's greatly diminished because it results in most people thinking, well, if this is what it takes to get these judges confirmed, the judges themselves must just be politicians in robes. And once that happens, and once people are of the view that a judge is really a politician in hiding, then to me that corrupts the legal process and gets into policy-making issues. And let's face it, that to some extent that's what's happened over a course of time. It used to be that the president's choice was generally understood that the president had pretty wide flexibility in picking somebody of a similar philosophy to what he or she would want. And but that's changed now. That now it's seemingly fair game that no matter who the president picks. And I've said if President Trump had nominated the equivalent of Oliver Wendell Holmes, that judge or that candidate would suffer the same indignities and the same political gamesmanship that we're going to see with Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. Because, as you point out, it's become political theater, and unfortunately, I think it has the effect of diminishing the seemingly non-political role intended for the Supreme Court, because it tends to, when you see like what Justice Thomas went through, for example, and what other candidates had to suffer to get on the court, or in some cases not to get on the court, as in the case of Bork. To me, it results in less respect for the court, because they think, oh my God, these people are just the political hacks that are somehow survived this awful process and now are deciding some of the most important questions in our legal system.
And I've got a question about Mr. Kavanaugh in a second, but with this kind of, and I love the term kabuki dance, because I was using that term earlier today, because that's what it's become. It's really become a grotesque kabuki dance. Are you finding then that number one, as a nation, we no longer require a civics education, and you and I both came from an educational tradition where we had to understand civics. And number two, do you find then, particularly at the court level, where there's where people are starting to kind of have second thoughts about what used to be considered to be the penultimate appointment of a jurist, someone who truly loved the law for the sake of the law. And I'm not sure if Americans really have an understanding of those people, those type of people anymore, because there exists, even to this day, an entire cadre, a culture of people who truly embraced the law as their lives.
Right.
Is it a civics issue, and are we about to lose those people?
Well, traditionally, it's hard to believe this, but the Supreme Court wasn't always people who came from a legal background.
Mm-hmm.
We had senators. Hugo Black, for example, was a very formidable judge, even though he came as a senator as his background. And Felix Frankfurter was a law professor rather than an appellate court judge before he was put on the court. And there were some folks that I think Justice Field also had a very non-conventional background. So there was probably more diversity in terms of background. It was all men, of course, in those days. So we're getting more diversity in the conventional sense of the word. But I think you're right that from a civics standpoint and from a pure love of the law standpoint, we may be sacrificing those two on this altar of political gamesmanship that now seems to invade the nomination process, or at least I should say the confirmation process, because that's the Senate has the constitutional duty to advise and consent. That's
right.
their role, and their advice. In the case of Merrick Garland, the advice in essence was, no, we're not even going to give him a hearing for the reasons that it was late in the term of Obama. And so there's controversy as to whether the Senate has that legal power. But given that the Constitution says they can advise and consent or not, presumptively they can, for a variety of reasons, many of which are political, make a decision not to consent and to advise the president that for those reasons or others, they're not going to go forward. So ultimately, the Constitution does make it a political decision on the part of a political body as to whether to consent to the president's nomination. And so naturally, whoever is in control, with at least a majority now, has the driving hand here. Now, it used to be that it required 60 votes, and there was a filibuster element that was involved. Right. But since the Democrats did away with it for appellate court judges, the Republicans then decided to do away with it for Supreme Court judges, and so now a majority is simply going to be able to put whoever they want on the Supreme Court.
The nuclear option.
The nuclear option.
Yeah. Let's talk about Kavanaugh for a second, then I want to go into a bunch of different issues. But I'm a libertarian, and my concern with Kavanaugh, as it's been expressed by the type of original thinking that I read, is an issue that truly defines the challenges of the judiciary, in that in the context of the Fourth Amendment and now the electronic frontier, I'll call it, there are issues being presented that are simply haven't been, didn't exist as recently as 10 or 20 years ago. Privacy concerns across an array of electronic media that didn't exist 5 or 10 years ago. The cloud, for example. What are the responsibilities of an electronic publisher? What about domestic spying? What about? It's been described that Kavanaugh is very weak on the Fourth Amendment. I for one, am never going to be one of these types that is caterwauling about, what's the term? Snowflake? I hate that term, but snowflaking or caterwauling and whining about an individual's personality. I'm, always going to be the type of citizen who's going to look to the issues. He seems to be, quote unquote, weak on this. My first question for you is, out of all the amendments, and I ask this a lot of high-level lawyers, the ACLU is a regular participant here, the Goldwater Institute, Cato's been on here, actually a fascinating little group of individuals have been nice enough to go on the show, and now you join us. What amendment do you believe is most under fire? And number two, is Kavanaugh weak on the Fourth Amendment? And are you concerned about that, or do you look to his strengths as a jurist overall to overcome that?
I think he'll overcome it. I think the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits broadly unreasonable searches and seizures, is obviously intended to preserve personal privacy and dignity from government intrusions that aren't warranted by what we call probable cause to believe a crime has been committed. Mm-hmm. That's the safeguard that is built into that. And so what's the challenge is, as you pointed out, there are so many new technologies that now are able to be much more intrusive and enable the government, in particular police forces specifically, to dig into people's personal lives in ways that were unimaginable at the time of the enactment of the Fourth Amendment. Right. So the basic legal issue is the use of the word unreasonable only what would have been unreasonable at the time of the founding and the ratification of that document, mm-hmm. or is that one of those forward-looking terms that has to be considered in light of present circumstances, and judges have to decide what's unreasonable in light of the technology that now exists and what people's reasonable expectations of privacy are, as compared to what showing the government needs to make in order to invade that privacy. Right. So that's where the rubber meets the road, so to speak, and that's where there's disagreements. And I think that in a time, and this is historically accurate, where in times of war, in times of terrorism, the Fourth Amendment has proven to be a lot more elastic in favor of the government than it has been in less violent or less threatening eras. Mm-hmm. So you've seen that across the course of history. But I think that hopefully Judge Kavanaugh, and I haven't studied this to a great degree, will respect the fact that privacy is a very important issue, particularly in Fourth Amendment questions. Mm-hmm. And it's not unreasonable, in my judgment, to make the government make a showing of probable cause to believe that a crime has been committed before one's privacy is invaded by any of these technological means that are now available.
Okay, that's fair enough. A couple of other issues on the federal level. And folks, if you're just joining us again, Justice Robert Flanders is joining us on the Coalition in a wide-ranging interview. We appreciate you spending all this time with us tonight. So far, we've talked a lot about the judiciary, as well as his background and his background as a citizen activist, as a barrister, and as someone who's been intimately involved in public life in Rhode Island now for a generation. The Second Amendment, that has raised some concerns among some and by the way, full disclosure, I'm a libertarian, so I believe in no government restrictions whatsoever. I virtually, at this point in my life, believe in almost no government to begin with. You actually gave strong testimony earlier in the show when you talked about the Rhode Island Constitution being far more clear-cut than even the federal Constitution, that there shall be no restrictions. Folks have been concerned about recent statements, particularly from, shall we say, the right of center community, which I inhabit, about the Second Amendment. Where do you stand on gun restrictions and the Second Amendment, whether it be things like red flag laws or gun control, what's the current term, the gun grabbers? What's your thoughts on it, and how do you reconcile that with, say, the Rhode Island Constitution?
So, first let me say that I think as a policy matter, most of that, if not all of it, is ineffective, in my opinion, to deter what most people who are proponents of those kind of restrictions are after, which is less incidents of gun violence and people going into schools and shooting our children and all of that. It's ineffective because even were you to enact all these restrictions that some of these folks are advocating, in my opinion, given the number of guns and particularly semi-automatic weapons that are now held by people, even a ban is not going to be effective to cause people who possess these to turn them in, and particularly it's not going to be effective to prevent the criminals who are going to use these weapons to do whatever they're going to do with them. So to me, as a policy matter, it's not a very effective way of proceeding. So I start with that. But I must say, from a legal standpoint, it's important to understand that the Second Amendment has never been interpreted to prevent government from, for example, restricting sales of guns to children, to minors, to mentally ill. So the absolutist position that no restrictions can possibly be consistent with the Second Amendment is baloney, because there have always been those kinds of common sense restrictions on who can possess guns, and it's never been deemed a violation of the Second Amendment to say that, for example, that children shouldn't be running around with semi-automatic weapons, and that we don't want mentally ill people to have access to them, and we don't want felons to have them. And that's one aspect. And also the type of weapons. It's never been deemed inconsistent with the Second Amendment to say that people shouldn't be allowed to have bazookas or tanks or other atomic bombs or something like that. So, you can take this to absurd levels. So, from a legal standpoint, all I can say to your listeners is that there are certain restrictions, such as the ones I've cited, that have never been deemed to run afoul of the Second Amendment. But, as I said at the outset, I think bans on semi-automatic weapons and these other kinds of restrictions that are being bandied about are very ineffective, and as a legislator, I would not be in favor of enacting those.
How do you feel about red flag laws?
Well, red flag laws are designed to be able to identify mentally ill people who potentially could be causing a problem if they use whatever weapons they have, and we're able to go forward with them. I feel that it's a tricky area because while we would all agree, I think that if we could be certain that someone was suffering from a mental problem that would lead to violent results, we would not want that person to have a gun to go in and shoot people, and particularly in schools and the like. But the problem comes in, it sort of weaponizes grudges between neighbors, and it's a very fearful process, because you can easily see how it can be used to seize people's legitimate right to keep and bear arms in situations where they're not really mentally ill, and it's just somebody who is having a grudge against them that wants to cause them misery and harm. So I would be very cautious about it, and I'm not satisfied that even a judicial officer will be able to adequately protect the constitutional interests of these folks to keep and bear arms. And so, but then that said, if someone has a long track record of violent behavior, and there's a record of mental illness, and in those situations, perhaps there might be some room for intervention there. But I would go very cautiously in that area.
Okay. Foreign policy. Now, clearly, Donald Trump has entered, and I appreciate your earlier statement when you said that you're going to view, see if I paraphrase this properly, and jump in if I carry this wrongly. If in fact that the viewpoints of Donald Trump are dilatory towards people of Rhode Island, then you're going to...
You don't mean dilatory.
I meant, yeah, sorry. But I'll make it simple. It's been a long day. If in fact Donald Trump's attitudes or policies are going to negatively impact Rhode Islanders, then you'll step in aggressively.
Yes.
In the case of the refugee situation, it's interesting because as libertarians, and I'm not trying to funnel this show through the prism of being a libertarian, but we typically have one of the more aggressive border policies. We actually believe in the free exchange of people, ideas, and commerce. And we're not at all obsessed with national borders per se. We recognize the right of a sovereign government to police their borders and to ensure the safety of their citizenry, but we believe that people largely should have free transport over borders to engage in, I'll call it positive behavior. And we need to actually make that easier. Donald Trump clearly, through his refugee bans, which continue to be challenged in court, and through his entire approach towards immigration, has been polarizing, to say the least. I'm trying to keep it quiet here. What's your attitude towards, what do you think is the ideal approach to immigration and immigration reform in this nation?
Well, I think it ought to be, first of all, I think we do need border security, if only to protect against terrorism and people who want to do us harm. Unfortunately, we're living in a world where people want to come to this country for bad reasons, and the memory of 9/11 is not too distant to know that were we to allow people free access to our country, I think we would pay a very high, steep price for that. So I think we need border security, and I support border security measures, if only for that reason. But as far as I think we need comprehensive immigration reform. I'd like to see us go to a more skills-based system. There's no question we need people to do certain tasks, and they are doing them now. We have people here working in our farm country, working in jobs that have historically gone to folks from other countries that have come here to work. And as long as they're law-abiding and are adding value by paying taxes and not breaking our laws, then I think we ought to have an immigration system that can accommodate those folks. But clearly, we have to address the situation of all the undocumented folks that are here now, and the DACA children, so-called. And I think, but it has to be part, in my opinion, of a more comprehensive solution that would include some increased border security measures, perhaps not to the extent that the president is asking for in terms of the wall, but I think we do need better border security, and I think that should be part of it. So my feeling about it is that we do need immigration reform. We need to compromise with the Democratic Party about what that will entail, but the current situation is, to me, not a good one, because we haven't addressed all these undocumented folks that are still here and are still coming across our borders, and do we want to continue to incent people to come here without going through the proper channels, or do we want to come to a new understanding of how people should come here? Do we want chain migration where remote family members can be brought here? Do we want a visa lottery system like we currently apparently have? Or is there some better way to do it, such as a skills-based system that I would favor?
Okay. Direct foreign policy. Right now, clearly, North Korea is starting to make noises this week. Again, interestingly enough, I just caught the headline on the way here today. Didn't have a chance to read it yet, but they're arguing now that the Americans aren't holding up their end of the bargain. to me, my libertarian roots say that anytime people are willing to negotiate with each other, then I should be happy about that. My middle-aged guy roots, having grown up in the era of the Cold War and been surrounded by rogue regimes, du jour, according them the dignity of direct negotiations with the United States without some type of, I don't know, first stage reform, whether it be political freedoms, is difficult for me to accept. So I balance those two. I'm just being honest. This is like a confessional here. On one hand, I'm glad he negotiated with him. Great, right? What could go wrong? On the second note, on the notion, the old Pat is kind of still whispering in my ear. Did we give the North Korean regime a boost, if you will, in the eyes of the world, or worse yet, in the eyes of the young man in charge, by according him the dignity of the office of the presidency? You're going to be called upon in the United States Senate to deal with these issues much more frequently than you're going to be called upon to deal with what's happening in Pawtucket. What's your take on a rogue nation like North Korea, and have we learned anything from our entanglements? Right now it's Yemen, around the country. Are we moving in the right direction in terms of a foreign policy?
Well, I think one of the lessons, I think, is it's always better where the president is not acting alone, but where he's acting with the authorization of Congress through treaties or through other measures where Congress can get to weigh in. So that I think one of the problems with a lot of what President Obama did, and the Iran deal is one example of that, the Paris Agreement is another, is these were executive agreements that didn't
Right.
have the status of treaties. And so we never had the backing of the U.S. Senate. And in many cases, it was because the president at that time knew that he wasn't going to get the approval of the Senate. And so he went ahead unilaterally and acted that way. And so that leaves it much easier for a new president like Donald Trump to come in and say, I don't agree with that agreement, and I'm going to back away from it. Now, in the case of the Iran deal, I think the president made the right call because it was full of Swiss cheese holes that Iran could avoid as a terrorist-sponsored nation. So my attitude is let's involve the Senate. One of the Senate's function has a big function in foreign treaties and approvals, and I think we'd be on much sounder ground if the president worked more with the Senate and instead of doing these unilateral deals like Obama was doing during his tenure. With regard to North Korea, I think many Americans, and I'm one of them, feel as you do, Pat, that while we breathed a sigh of relief when it seemed that the name-calling had ceased and the parties were at least talking to one another, we're all concerned that this has been a pattern of North Korea for time immemorial, it seems, to promise and then renege. And so I think that the sound policy there has to be verify, and take a hard line with them about denuclearization and not accept empty promises because they're meaningless unless it's backed up by action. And so I think my attitude is, okay, you made a start, and that's better than threatening nuclear annihilation to each other, but absent a verifiable denuclearization path, I would not let my foot off the pedal in terms of sanctions and ratcheting up the pressure on North Korea to force them to get to the point where they live up to what they say they will. And so my approach is we got to take a hard line with these rogue nations and not just accept empty promises. On the other hand, I think that we need to sit down with all of them and negotiate until it's clear that the negotiations are an empty shell game.
I think under the Bush regime, Bush 2, I think they referred, or was Bush 1, referred to it as constructive engagement. At the same time, though, it's interesting you bring up the role of the Senate, and we have the War Powers Act, and I'm trying to think the last time we declared war. Did we actually declare war on Grenada? I'm not sure that we.
I don't know that we did. I
Right.
think that was another unilateral presidential action.
Right.
Yeah. So
You have to go back to.
I I mean, there are attempts to put limits on how far the president can go in terms of engaging our troops before he has to seek a war resolution. But I favor more involvement of the Senate before we commit the resources of the United States to these foreign interventions. But there are cases where it would be justified. But in the meantime, though, the president has all kinds of tools available by way of sanctions that he is in fact deploying with Iran and North Korea. And in both cases, I think those are absolutely justified.
It's interesting because as a libertarian, we look to end the circle of violence when we look to the nations that we're using indiscriminate drone warfare against in these undeclared wars / police actions / definition. And I'm not singling out President Trump. The previous regime engaged in the same type of behavior. In fact, we've got decades now where we wage war on civilizations, entire civilizations, and then we're somewhat astonished when they get mad. So when I say this, I'm not trying to put you on the spot relative to the Republican president, because Obama was just as bad. But at what point in time does the Senate say, well, no mas, no more?
No, I think certainly at any point where there's substantial commitment of American troops, that to me is a red line where the Senate needs to be involved. And that does get into the war powers resolutions and things like that. But even now with the availability of drones and the ability to inflict massive human casualties on nations, in some cases, because of the conditions that we're fighting, it's justified. But to me, I think doubts should be resolved by trying to get the backing of the Senate for these actions rather than doing it unilaterally.
Spying, domestic spying. Where do you or do you not draw the line on that? I mean, we continue to turn our increasingly sophisticated technology inward. And again, successive administrations have done their best to engage in different levels of domestic spying. Where do we stop this? You've got extra legal courts now. Ironically, it was the Republican Party, I believe, that wrote us the Patriots Act, which is, if you're a civil libertarian, you consider rather unpatriotic. How do you feel about the Patriot Act and the type of broad authorities that it gave the American government?
Well, I don't like this FISA court,
Right.
Which is basically a very secretive star chamber proceeding where the public has no insight into what's going on there, and it's all done in secret. And so, to me, that just breeds contempt and disrespect for the law. I think domestic spying ought to be limited to those cases where there's foreign involvement with whatever domestic spying, if you want to call it that, is going on. The idea of deploying our CIA or other intelligence agencies against our own people, to me, is revolting. Absent foreign involvement and reason to believe, probable cause to believe that laws are being violated, that's approved by a judicial officer in the same way that we authorize search warrants and wiretaps and other procedures. You might not, I don't know if you consider that to be domestic spying, but that obviously happens routinely in criminal investigations, but it's always in the context of a showing being made to a judge that there's probable cause. Here's the evidence, here's the affidavits of the people, and therefore, after that showing is made, for a limited period, an authorization is given to engage in some activity that might, under a broad interpretation, be deemed domestic spying. So I think we need judicial protections against that sort of thing. And in terms of deploying our intelligence agencies, I think that should be limited to foreign intervention issues.
Okay. The war on drugs. You earlier mentioned, you talked about the opioid epidemic. Is it time for the American government to just kind of wake up to the notion that prohibition mentality, whether it be the Volstead Act, whether it be, well, just about anything, that it's time to stop that type of victimless engagement in people's lives let them live their own lives and just deschedule cannabis?
Well, I wish it was victimless, Pat. The opioid crisis has been anything but victimless, as you know. Here.
Well, I'm asking about, no, I understand. I'm asking about cannabis, though, as far as marijuana.
Oh, marijuana? Well, I'm not sure marijuana is victimless either. I would prefer to be cautious there. I'd like to see how other states, like Colorado, which have been permitting it, how are they faring with legalization for recreational use? Has it proven to be a gateway drug for opioids or other things? Has it proven to be a nightmare in terms of inducing more vehicular accidents and problems with detecting who's operating under the influence? Because it's much harder to detect that type of use by police officers. So I would be a cautious adopter. I sympathize with the idea that we want to give people maximum freedom to do things. Such, prohibition didn't work with alcohol, and I appreciate that the same argument can be made with marijuana, perhaps. But I'd like to, as I say, be cautious about it and not just advocate that Rhode Island, for example, should rush into that. I'd rather let's see how it's working in other states that are trying it. But I do think that it's more of a state issue than I'd like to see it be experimented with at the state level. Let's see how it works. But I wouldn't want the federal government to sort of preempt everybody and say, all right, now we're going to legalize marijuana. Let's see how it works in the states. And if enough states have a good experience with it and it generates more tax revenue and all of that, okay, then maybe we can consider it at the federal level. But I'd go slow on that.
Offline, not tonight, but offline, I'm going to work on you on that. I'm going to provide you with the information you need.
Okay.
Because ultimately, what we see happening is that cannabis, number one, it's the fact that it's been scheduled federally really limits the amount of real research that can be done on it, so that we can prove once and for all. I will never claim that there's this panacea that will happen once cannabis is legalized. But at the same token, there is significant first-level clinical trials and anecdotal evidence to provide that this may be a more positive way of mitigating pain than anything that the opioids have brought us. And the frustration is...
So you're talking about medical use of marijuana?
Well, medical or even, and then...
I thought you were...
Well, no, I'm actually addressing both. And because then, too, on a behavioral level, the war on drugs largely, for us, is failed. Because ultimately, just like attempts at prohibiting alcohol, attempts at prohibiting guns, attempts at prohibiting cannabis, anyone who wants it can get it. And it's really just created much more difficult circumstances in terms of it being doctored, the type of narco-terrorism that's been generated, because you'll see in any prohibition mentality, as I like to say, we had Chicago and gangland killings during the Volstead Act in the 1920s. We've offshored, if you will, we've outsourced our gangland violence to Central and Latin America in the case of, legalizing or not choosing to legalize cannabis. But we'll go, once you're a senator, we'll go tit for tat on that a little bit. We'll volunteer, imagine that, at the federal level. I could probably go out all night. I won't keep you here all night. What message would you like, and I'd like to give you ample time to promote any upcoming fundraisers you have, how web access, all that, but if you were going to speak to, and use this as an opportunity to film a commercial, if you will, where you're going to speak directly to the people of Rhode Island and talk about yourself in a kind of the elevator pitch, if you will. I choose not to focus on your opponent. I think your opponent's got a record that, quite frankly, speaks for itself. Oy. We have a lot of friends in this audience for the people who are suffering, if you will, at the hands of what we like to say is invenergy. And the notion that someone who would cloak himself in the flag of environmentalism would be so reticent to engage himself at any level, even if it was just to be the honest broker, and use the clout he's got as a United States Senator to solve Burrowville is astonishing to me. I mean, it's I'll say this, I'm not asking you to me, it's a new benchmark in governmental hypocrisy. I guess he likes to make money off of big energy companies, not get involved in working with them to prevent issues like that. But I said that, not you. So give Rhode Islanders your elevator pitch, if you will.
It's time for a change. It's time for someone who's going to go down there and serve Rhode Island's interests. Someone who's a problem solver, who's got a history of working to bring people together. I think, like many of you who are listening to this, I'm frustrated with the hyper-partisanship that we see in Washington. I think we need somebody who can bring both sides together and get to results that matter for this state, that will make a difference in the average Rhode Islander's life, that will help small business, and foster a better sense of what politics can accomplish. I think many of us are sick to death of the usual hyper-partisanship that we're seeing with lifetime politicians. I'm a big believer in term limits. Let's get a citizen legislator down there, someone who's got experience working in the private sector, that hasn't spent all his life as a politician, someone who knows what it's like to live paycheck to paycheck, and that can work with average Rhode Islanders and other folks to get us to a better place. Rhode Island can punch above its weight. We have 2 senators like New York, like Texas, like California. Wouldn't it be great to have somebody down there who can work hard on our behalf and not just be thinking about feathering his own nest at the expense of the real interests of Rhode Island? Look, Rhode Island's been a great state. I consider myself the embodiment of the American dream. It's been a wonderful state to me. I want to give back to the state. That's the only reason I'm running for this office. And if you give me the chance, I'm going to show you what a senator from Rhode Island can do. Thank you.
How can folks find you on the web?
FlandersForSenate.com.
Okay. And what events and where can folks find you? You've got any public events coming up in the next few weeks?
Bunch of fundraisers. They're all listed on my website. I'm not going to go through them here right now, but yes, you can see what I'm doing. I have Joe at the Judge events that I do 2 or 3 times a week at different states, different cities all over the state. Early morning coffees. I go out and meet with folks from different communities and have discussion of the issues with them. So very accessible. My office is, headquarters is in Warwick at the Lowe's Shopping Center there on Greenwich Avenue. Love to have people stop in and say hello.
The subject du jour this week in the mass media was the D word, the debate word. When can we look forward to seeing you? I believe this is, by the way, just editorial note, I believe that a debate between you and the incumbent senator has got all the opportunity to be one of the great political and philosophical debates that we're going to see in a long time. I mean, it's got huge potential to really, I'm thinking Rock'em Sock'em Robots, not so much for the theatrics, but both of you are experienced in their own ways, have got a great deal of gravitas, and there's clearly a lifelong track record for both of you. That's out there. Will there be a debate scheduled? Has there been conversations?
I would hope there'll be multiple debates, but there haven't been any conversations yet. He's got a primary, I've got a primary, but I would welcome as many debates as he would agree to. I'll be lucky probably to get one, but I will debate him as much as he would like to.
Rhode Islanders really need to get ahead of this debate issue, and Rhode Islanders, they need for the two of you to debate.
Absolutely. No reason we shouldn't.
I mean, this is, you know, in terms at the federal level, this is probably the first, and this is not to denigrate other candidates who have run. There's some wonderful people who have run. But again, there's a real opportunity. There's such clear differences between expertise, opinions, strategies, philosophies, lives,
Absolutely.
how lives have been led,
Absolutely.
perspective. I mean, all of that exists on a grand level that it's really hard to find at this point. I mean, you know, you just don't see these type of differences by two individuals who have both operated at the highest levels of government.
Absolutely. That's why I think it would be a good thing, and I hope he sees it that way. I would be delighted to debate him on multiple occasions, perhaps devoting different debates to certain issues, foreign policy issues, domestic issues, and so forth.
And almost ideal would be literally a debate, pick a half a dozen issues and have a debate on each one.
Absolutely. Love to do that.
So you're not hiding out in the trenches at all.
Not at all.
You're, as they say, you are ready to rumble.
Absolutely.
Well, I know you've got an incredible schedule right now. I'm thrilled that you're running. I wish you nothing but the best. And I look forward to, I'll be following the campaigns closely.
Good. Patch, thank you so much for having me.
It's wonderful stuff.
Appreciate it.
Justice Robert Flanders, let's see if I go down the list. Young sanitation engineer, Brown University graduate. You played football and baseball, baseball at a very high level. Jurist, corporate lawyer, activist. You brought all that to bear in terms of really turning around the community of Central Falls. And if I can sum it up, you're looking to bring that same life set of experiences to work for the people of Rhode Island and the United States Senate.
Absolutely.
Well, thank you again for having me on.
Thank you again, Pat.
Folks, we're going to take, I think we're going to just kind of sum it up a little bit early tonight. We are the Coalition, loud and proud, outrage porn-free, civilly disobedient media, broadcasting live on the Worldwide Coalition Network here at the GoLocalLive Broadcast Center in the heart of the city we love, Providence, Rhode Island. You know, tonight we had two individuals on, a young man, another man much like myself, a little bit more seasoned, but both, as we talk about the hashtag that dominates the show, both hashtag take it very, very personally, and both are committed to really raising the bar in terms of the civic life here in Rhode Island. We should be grateful for them. We should also, we can take a moment to thank our sponsors for tonight. As always, Yacht Club Bottling Works, you know, premium soda, Rhode Island's boutique soda before we even knew about boutique sodas. Beacon Shipping and Logistics, 1-855-3-SHIP-IT. And of course, Air Sciences, providing mold remediation, interfering with biological hazards, cleanups both for your home, your office, your school, airsciences.net. Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, on the mighty Twitter at Coalition_radio. Something we'll be following again this week, our all apolitical anti-billionaire baseball boys club Twitter feed at Pawtucket is home. And of course, the mothership coalitionradio.us, where these and all of our shows at some point, when we finally get to load them, will live in perpetuity. Of course, I point out to you not only tonight's show, which will hopefully get up this weekend, but also a broadcast from a few years ago from Coalition 1.0 when we were over at the WPRO complex, the fine people over there, where we had an interview, turned out to be very prescient, with, in fact, folks surrounding the Central Falls bankruptcy, including our guest tonight, including Mike Riley, who's running for Rhode Island Treasurer, and their thoughts and their perspectives on Providence and other cities in Rhode Island. It was prescient, it was timely, as it is now.